Hello, everyone. I'm Chip Fairchild, the 50th president of the Caltech Associates. This is the first time the Associates have partnered with the Caltech Management Association, and we are pleased to jointly showcase the very best of Caltech and JPL for you today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Caltech Associates, we have proudly supported Caltech since 1926. Annual membership empowers Caltech scientists and engineers to pursue bold, risky ideas that just might be tomorrow's revolutionary technology, a new understanding of our universe, or an urgent medical discovery or application like the one we will see today. Associates members include Caltech alumni and parents, Caltech and JPL employees, and people like me who have no other affiliation with Caltech but are passionate about supporting the Institute, enjoy the challenge of learning, and want to witness the scientific breakthroughs that happen there as they happen. Caltech researchers recently shifted their focus, resources, and tools to address the COVID-19 crisis. And as that happened, the financial resources the Associates provide have never been more important. Caltech and the Associates thank you for your continuing engagement and ongoing support through this challenging time. It is now my privilege to introduce Rob Manning, JPL Chief Engineer and Caltech Management Association Board Member, who was a driving force behind the subject of today's presentation, a ventilator for emergency use authorization, referred to as VITAL, which stands for Ventilator Intervention Technology Accessible Locally. In addition to his work on that effort, I would also like to thank him and the other presenters for the substantial time they spent organizing this presentation for us today. Rob?
Chip, thank you very much. That was very nice of you. Hi, I'm Rob Manning. I am JPL's Chief Engineer, and I'm a member of the Caltech Management Association, or CMA for short. The CMA strives to bring stimulating and cross-fertilizing talks, stories, and presentations to the JPL and Caltech communities. From the arts to sciences and engineering, we try to inspire our community to find new connections and new ideas that will make our wonderful institution even better. And so, as Chip mentioned, we have a treat for you today. As Anios had mentioned, that I was very, very fortunate to have been on this JPL ventilator team from the very beginning. As Chip said, we called our project VITAL. The VITAL project was born out of our very deep concern and worry about the impending COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular, the availability of ventilators for COVID patients. We thought and hoped we might be able to help. But fortunately, JPL is filled with passionate, smart people who come together with their diverse talents and endless energy and who make it their mission to make a positive difference in the world. So today, you will hear some of our team members who will share our VITAL story with you and answer some of your questions. In a few minutes, you'll be meeting JPL engineer and fellow VITAL teammate, Sarah Hovsepian, who will be acting as moderator for today's discussion. But first, allow me to introduce our project with a short video.
We are designing an easy and rapidly mass manufacturable ventilator device, and it is a crazy project.
This crisis is unprecedented in our lives and requires unprecedented action.
I'm so amped up. I mean, it really, the adrenaline rush, it's exciting, but it's exhausting. And I think we all just want to do everything we can to try to help.
You ready?
Yeah. Oh, very cool. That's awesome.
I would say the biggest personal challenges that I have myself is I don't have time to sleep.
I think what JPL brings to the table is extraordinary talent. It also brings to the table tremendous innovation. The third thing it brings to the table is tremendous focus. The other thing that I felt, I see it in our team, and that is a call to duty. I have this talent, I'm an engineer or a scientist, I can do something.
We have the potential to save human lives, people that we might know, our neighbors, our families. And that intensity, amazing. It's amazing. And as stressful as this has been for everybody in the last couple of weeks, not one of us can stop.
Talk about the adrenaline rush. Could you all feel the raw emotions in that footage as this was at the height of the crisis just 1 month into the project? Welcome, I'm Sarah Hovsepian, your moderator and host for this evening. Yeah! The last time I hosted an event, there was a live audience. And if you've forgotten what that means, yes, it means human beings under one roof, 6 inches apart, coughing and breathing all over each other, touching door handles with their bare hands. It's quite ridiculous and shocking to think about how we all behaved back then. But I really want to welcome you virtually on the other side of the screen. I also want to thank the production team behind the screens right now who are doing an amazing job just making this happen, including Dan Goods and Marco Tempest all the way in Switzerland. Hello. Despite the crisis, today we are celebrating the courage, the hope, and self-sacrificing spirit. In the past 6 months, these individuals, they're our colleagues, our mates, and our friends. They've paved the way to write an entirely different story. This is a story about facing a very new crisis, a very new reality, and a new uncertainty with a determination to save lives. It is my absolute distinct honor to welcome 2 individuals from the Vital team who have become my friends and who have decided to share with you and I details about the ventilator project, never before shared, by the way, with a large audience, and I mean you across the screen right there, outside of JPL. Side note, I have yet to meet them in person. I'm saying they're real people, but I have yet to meet them. We've met virtually. I am so delighted to welcome our first guest panelist, Dr. Leon Alkalai. Dr. Alkalai is a fellow at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, California Institute of Technology. He joined JPL in 1989 after getting his PhD at UCLA. Currently, Leon manages the Office of Strategic Partnerships at JPL and is the project manager of the JPL Vital Ventilator Project. Leon distinguished himself in the formulation of new mission concepts for the exploration of our solar system, for which he received not 1, but 2 distinguished NASA Individual Achievement Medals. 1 for the formulation of the Grail mission to the Earth's moon in 2012, and the other for the successful formulation and commissioning, and you've heard of it, the InSight lander on Mars in 2019. I also want to add that Leon is one of the only people I know who's ever observed during this pandemic to be able to calm his barking dog simply by walking off camera for a few seconds. One day we were in the middle of a presentation and the dog started barking and we turned our heads and Leon calmly said, of course, "I'm sorry, they don't like the gardeners." Well, I hope the gardeners are okay, Leon.
They are okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the wonderful introduction.
We also have our next guest panelist, Roger Gibbs, who has over 40 years of experience here at JPL. He has worked a variety of roles on designing and building deep space science missions, including science instrument engineer on Galileo's mission to Jupiter, payload and spacecraft system engineer on Mars Observer, spacecraft system engineer on Cassini's mission to Saturn. Go watch that documentary on Netflix, it's great. And also, he's worked on development of several new mission concepts, including a Mars atmosphere collection and return to Earth mission, and a mission to Jupiter's moon, Europa, to search for signs of life. Roger has held management positions, including Division Manager of the Avionics, Power, Robotics, and Trajectory Division. Also, Deputy Director of the Mars Exploration Directorate, and is currently the Deputy Director of the Engineering and Science Directorate. I also want to add, Roger, that didn't you plant a whole tomato farm in your backyard during this pandemic?
Hello, Sarah. Thank you. And our tomato crop crested about 2 weeks ago. But yes, we've been enjoying very good tomatoes during this COVID season.
Fantastic. And you did that for fun, right? Well, we all have our interesting hobbies. Welcome, Roger. I'm Sarah Hovsepian. I've been at JPL for 2 years as the task manager on autonomous swarm robotics project called Puffer for future lunar surface exploration. I've also assisted as task manager on the JPL Next EELS robot, which is a snake-like robot that will search for signs of life on the ocean world of Enceladus. On the Vital team, I was the executive officer and verification and validation lead. We have exciting themes to help us frame the various facets of the Vital story. These include the inspiration of the idea. Where did the idea originate? Also, project management, I call people management. How was the team formed and the roles structured? Also, design. What was our approach? What were some of those early concepts? Then we'll talk about testing. How did we verify and validate our results? Also, production. What was the process like to produce numerous prototypes? Also, regulatory. What regulations would the ventilator need to meet in order to be used in hospitals and medical facilities? And finally, licensing. How would JPL ultimately position itself to infuse this life-saving device into our global market? I just want to remind the audience members, you across the screen, we will have a Q&A at the very end after discussing all the themes. So please go ahead and submit your questions at any time during the event at the bottom of your screen, specifically where it says Q&A. Otherwise, if you submit it in the other box, then it's going to go to our production team and they're probably not going to answer your question. All right, well, let's begin with our first theme and video, the inspiration behind the birth of the ventilator idea.
It was mid-March, and Rob Manning and I were in the cafeteria, bumped into the line, checkout line, having our coffees in hand. Rob and I were chit-chatting, and I fired off an email saying, I think there's something we can do here at JPL with the COVID situation, our engineering expertise to save lives. And that would be to try to solve the ventilator shortage problem, which at that time looked very severe. We back and forth emailed a little bit, and the following Monday, which was, Wednesday to a Monday, we had a kickoff. We'd included, in fact, some medical people, Dr. Kurovich, incredible guy, extremely knowledgeable about ventilators, ventilation, what you need to do for patients with COVID. He gave us a tutorial, and we were off and running from that point. So it's kind of funny. We originally thought, maybe we can go to the hardware store and find some motors and some tubing and maybe an Arduino to control all this, and that would work. And pretty quickly it was, no, we got to do something a lot more serious, but actually a lot more JPL-like in terms of rigor, engineering, testing, and even coming up with FDA authorization to use the devices on real patients, which is critical because hospitals won't just use any jury-rig MacGyver kind of thing. And within a short period of time, 5 weeks or so, we had a working prototype and had submitted for the FDA. And the support from JPL management was incredible. From the very beginning, it was, see what you can do, tell us what you want to do. We're not going to tell you what to do, but just convince us that this is a good thing and it can be done. And we didn't really know at the beginning. We knew it was a good thing, but we didn't know it could be done. But the more we looked at it, the more it looked possible. And JPL management, Dave Gallagher, in particular, just embraced our task and provide the support that was more than enabling. Without it, we would not have been able to do this. It was just incredible.
So I'm thinking it does pay off to take your coffee breaks in the morning, right? But equally important to have super supportive management that believes in your idea. So without further ado, let's jump into our first theme, the inspiration. On the morning of March 11th, Rob Manning and Dave Van Buren met at the cafeteria unexpectedly and realized the urgency to pull together a team. Let's start with you, Leon. How did you hear about the project, and at what point did you decide to get involved?
Thank you, Sarah. So I like Dave's video, and if you notice that at one point he said, and a few emails went back and forth. Well, that's kind of where I got one of those first emails that was on the morning of March 12th. And I actually checked a few minutes ago, the email from David Van Buren to me said something like, "Hi, Leon, I hear this is in your swim lane." And that's in 3 dots. And I got that email, I called him. I'm sorry?
No, I'm just kidding. I know you have a pool, so you've been swimming.
That's right. So that was the first email I got from David Van Buren. And then I reacted to that email. We talked, and I kind of shared with him that this is something that is very consistent with a vision that we've had for some time, that JPL can do something, not just in medical engineering, but do something good for society that is not necessarily strictly space science. And what I did immediately was to reach out to Dave Gallagher, our associate director, and told him, you know, I think this is a good thing. We should support this. And Dave got back to me and said, absolutely, let's go with it. And between that and the next Monday, we got this project up and running.
Well, all of you listening in, if you have new ideas, you know who to go to, right? I love that you had such a positive reaction. What about you, Roger?
Well, let's see. I started to see emails a couple of days after that famous cafeteria meeting. Rob Manning sent me and others some emails on this topic. And Charles Wetzel, the director, I'm the deputy director, Charles Wetzel and I were conversing that said, you know, the folks that are going to be doing this are going to come out of our directorate. Maybe one of us should keep an eye on it. And it intrigued me, and I did. And I set up a meeting on over the weekend with Dave Van Buren and his division manager. And that was the first time I ever met Dave. And so we had a conversation in the morning. As I recall, I put out some ideas, said we needed to define some requirements, we need some structural items. And then that led to that fated Monday afternoon meeting with the whiteboard, Dr. Gurovich. And by the way, Sarah, you and I were in that same meeting, so we sort of met.
I was going to ask, were we all in the same meeting? Were you there, Leon?
I was virtually there. I did not. Okay. I was not physically there. I called in.
Yeah. So for the audience, that was a time that JPL was transitioning to remote work because of COVID. So this thing hit at the same time that we were planning to figure out how do we get 6,500 employees to show up the previous Friday, not to show up that week, and continue to get their work done. So it was a chaotic period of time.
I can only imagine. Well, Roger, so the idea gains traction. 5 days later, you mentioned we have this kickoff meeting on March 16th, right? What were you feeling at that kickoff meeting?
So let's see. There were a couple of thoughts. One of them is I want to keep track on these people so they don't get into trouble, that they don't get JPL and Caltech into trouble, to see if I can help them. So there were a variety of thoughts. It was an intriguing idea. And as Dave mentioned in that inspirational video, when we kicked this off, we were thinking that within a small number of weeks, the number of COVID patients without access to a ventilator and who would therefore die might be measured in terms of 300,000, 500,000, or something of that sort. So there were a number of emotions going on and thoughts, and how do we structure this so we might be successful?
That's really interesting. So I'm wondering though, earlier in this process, of course you're thinking, what does JPL really bring to the table, considering we're not experts in the medical field, right? Leon, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, for me, there was, like Roger said, to me, it was very clear that JPL has a lot of talent and a lot of capability. There was no real issue about that. And then also in the field of medical devices, we were all aware that we are not the experts, and so that there was, what I felt was, just like Roger, we wanted to understand the potential, we know the talent, but is this really going to close? Is this really going to be something that we can ultimately deliver, that makes sense, and so on? The question about talent was never an issue. There's so much talent at JPL. And in this case, what was so unique was the energy level. We start with the inspiration and Rob and Dave and so on. The energy level to do something was just really tremendous and unique. Even for all the missions that we do, the nature of this kind of endeavor was very unique.
Yes, it was very unique. And you talk about that energy, and that energy being geared towards finding people externally. For example, Roger, how soon was Dr. Michael Gurvich, a pulmonologist from Huntington Hospital, involved here?
So he was, from my perspective, from the very start. I believe it was Dave Van Buren who had a connection at Caltech who said, I think he said, I play tennis with this doctor, you need to talk to him. And so Dr. Gurvich joined us Monday afternoon. And by the way, that was the first time that I saw the potential for this team. I don't want to geek out on requirements, but it is critical for any technical development to have good requirements. It was especially critical when we're saying we need to do something in a number of weeks. And so I watched the team, you included, you were at the whiteboard writing down all of these scribbles. And so we looked at—
I don't know what I was writing, really.
What are the requirements? What do we need to do? And we had several very important, we had at least two pivotal decisions come out of that meeting as we talked to Dr. Mike. And what an amazing doctor. I mean, he's a medical doctor who could talk to engineers. Our engineers could understand from him what are the key and driving requirements, what must we do, and what can we abandon, because we had to make this a minimal capability ventilator. So he started at the very beginning. We pivoted to requiring an FDA approval, a very major decision. We made that decision the next day as we looked across the team and said, okay, everybody, what do you say about FDA approval? And everyone said yes. So that first meeting with Dr. Mike was amazing.
Yeah, I remember that distinctly. I actually felt a lot more comfortable too, knowing that there was a pulmonologist there and he was giving us so much information. That was great. I also quickly want to touch on, Leon, what made you contact the head of the FDA? Because this is really important.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So the other thing, let me just add to the previous topic, is that what I learned from Dr. Gurvich, which was so critical for the rest of the project, he described something to us that I think we understood. We're designing a medical device, a control device, and then we have the lungs in a patient. And he basically told us, think about these two systems as one system. The device interfaces with biology, with the lungs back to the device. So when he started talking about system of systems, to me, this is our language. One of them is biology, but looking at the whole as a system was something we understand. So to your question, it was very clear. It was actually on day 3 that as a team, we pivoted and said, this notion of building something quickly and just putting it on open source and everybody can go to Home Depot and buy their own parts and build a ventilator. We actually made a few phone calls. I made a phone call, a few others, to hospitals, and including Huntington, and say, would you use a device if it was, you can build it, anybody can build it. And they said, absolutely not. Don't even, if it doesn't have FDA seal of approval, they won't use it, they won't even touch it. And so on day 3, I was asked to, part of my role at JPL is strategic partnerships. I was asked to, if I can reach out to the FDA and get something going, which I did.
That's incredible. I was so excited to hear that the FDA lead was tied in like 3 days into this project. Absolutely phenomenal. And you looked him up, right? You actually looked for his phone number on the website and called him up, right?
It was totally out of the cold. I went into Google, did some searching and found the webpage on the FDA website. and I looked at all the devices, ventilators and so on. And at the bottom, it had an email and the name of Dr. James Lee. And I just right away just sent him an email and gave a little introduction. And it did have my, my kind of name and signature at the bottom. And to my surprise, within less than an hour, I got an email back from Dr. James Lee. And he said, let's talk this afternoon. It was our 4 p.m., his 7 p.m. in Washington, D.C. And we just hit it off. We had a great conversation.
I love that story. I absolutely love that story. It's incredible. And I'm sure Dr. Lee has taken his phone number off the website. Well, okay, I want to talk a little about project management. We had this idea, we had the adrenaline rush, which brings us to this theme of how important it was not only to have excellent leaders from upper management, but also to have the right people on the team, right? And we know your roles. So let's talk a little about your roles. And I want to talk real quick. Roger, what was your role on this team? And then Leon, what was your role?
So as I mentioned at the start, I came in to kind of keep eyes on things and maybe offer a little advice. And in that Monday meeting, I concluded that I thought that there was a role for me as project manager. I started to operate as project manager to see if anybody objected or complained. Nobody did. And so I took on that role of project manager through the development of the prototype and FDA approval. And then I went back to my day job primarily, and Leon took over from there.
I'm sure you miss it, don't you?
I miss it very much. One of the highlights, in some measures, the highlight of my working career.
Great, thank you very much. So Leon, what is your role? What was your role before and what's your role now?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I started with Roger on day one on March 16. And what I like actually about it is that we did not start by formally defining our positions or titles. It really was, to me at least, it wasn't important. It was more to fit in, to lead, and to help. So I had, in general, my role was to be, I was in charge of external relationships, external contacts, but I also was mentoring various people on the team. And I also was assisting Roger in anything he needed. And we would often talk before our daily tag-ups and after our team tag-ups. So I felt it was my role to be very there to support Roger.
I love it. I love it. So one thing that I wanted to really talk about right here and touch base on before we move on to our next topic is that, Roger, the team also quickly recognized your ability to trust, empower, encourage, and provide direction to each person in their roles on the team. I can say for myself, I felt like I could do anything because you really believed in us. So can you tell us a little about how this relates to the way that you personally evaluate and made important decisions on the team?
Well, first of all, the demands of this situation, lives at stake, 2 months, 1.5 months, 3 months to get this done, required us to operate at a rapid pace. I mean, that's an understatement. And so the notion that I had was, if we have people who have talent, and we did, then my job was to understand how to carve out the work. Okay, I'm going to sound like a geek here. How to carve out a work so the interfaces were well understood, but the people within that domain could go get their job done. Number one, I like to trust people, give them the job, encourage them, and trust that they will get the job done. And at one point I was wondering, what do I do if somebody fails to match up and satisfy my trust? It never happened. And so there was an element of, we have to do that. We have to let people go and say, go do that work. There was much more than I could, if I had micromanaged this, it would never have gotten done. So trust was, trust, empowerment, tell them what is expected of them, and then let them go.
Roger, I feel like we need more leaders like you. Thank you so much for trusting in us. Well, with the idea in mind and a powerfully motivated team, including unequivocal support from upper management, this leads to my next theme, design. Let's watch a video and hear from the team lead engineer, Mike Johnson, about what it took to come up with a design that really works.
When we started the ventilator effort, we weren't sure exactly how ventilators worked in detail, and we needed to come up to speed very quickly. we set out to put together something that was very simple, used as few parts as possible, and definitely did not use parts that were in the normal mainstream of medical products. We developed a set of requirements. Using that set of requirements, we then proceeded to come up with hardware designs that met all those requirements. We didn't know which ones would work and pan out and which ones might not. We ended up with two different designs, one called the pneumatic and one called the compressor. The pneumatic unit uses air pressure from an outside source, and it modifies those pressures inside using mechanical regulators and directs it using inside with solenoids. The compressor unit uses a compressor, a motor-driven compressor fan to generate the pressure, and the output is then selected to a lower pressure from that higher pressure with another internal regulator. We knocked them off one at a time, and sometimes some of them were particularly resistive, but we had a group of people who were willing to work extremely long hours and come up with solutions to some of the problems that were pretty tricky.
My favorite quote was, "We weren't sure exactly how ventilators worked, and we needed to come up to speed quickly." How true was that, right? Well, Roger, this brings me to a mantra that you had and that you repeated to the team. And if you can first start off with what that mantra was, and then tell us a little about how the team came up with good functional requirements.
Thank you, Sarah. So I found the mantra useful because when I would talk to Dave Gallagher or the EC or companies outside or even internal to JPL, I found it, and particularly the team, to focus them. It was a minimally capable ventilator, suitable for a significant fraction of the COVID patients. And the reason it was phrased that way is it needed to be minimum capability. There are ventilators out there that are very capable. To be quick, it had to be minimum capable. And a significant fraction of COVID patients was likewise intending to limit the scope so we didn't make it suitable for everybody. And so that mantra, in fact, that mantra was established pretty early and remained unchanged all the way through delivery.
Yeah, that was really helpful for me too, because I know listening to that mission statement and purpose repeated again and again on a team is so helpful for all of us. Just really helped honed in what we were actually doing day in and day out. Another thing this reminds me of is the fact that in order to really look at what those good functional requirements would be like and putting together the right list, we held at least 3 peer reviews, right, in the early stages of the project. Leon, I want to ask you, can you describe to the audience or the listener what those reviews were about and how it contributed to our lessons learned?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So there also was a question in the chat room about what were some of the technical requirements and so on. It's important to understand that we had Dr. Gurovich, but also Dr. Matt Levin from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, who were specifically coming to our meetings and saying something like, I've just come out of the ICU and I see what we're doing with the ventilators and our patients, and we need a higher PEEP, we need a higher pressure, we need a larger, we need to use higher fractions of oxygen. So they were coming with requirements straight out of the ICU saying, can you go beyond what the current ventilators can do? So we had real requirements coming out of the physicians, clinicians, doctors in the ICU telling us what kind of a system they would like us to build.
So as these requirements are coming in, really, at the same time, we're building all of these prototypes. And I distinctly remember there was a story earlier on where Mike was trying to get a prototype together. Roger, can you tell us a little about that early story?
Well, so, I mean, again, we were in a situation where we're starting, we have weeks to go. Is there a there? Can we come up with a design that will meet there? And we were off to a great start. We had functional requirements defined. Mike Johnson impressed me on that very first day. He was deconvolving a ventilator into subsystems. So this is all going very well. And then we started to build prototypes, and they were failing in one way or another. And so there was this notion of I think it was a 3-phase motor, and it didn't work. And Mike said, I sent my wife out to Home Depot to buy some vacuum cleaners. And I think I just was like this. And so we're talking, but inside I'm going, oh my God, what are we doing? So there were just a couple of times, that was one of them, where I was momentarily depressed or very concerned, but it was that notion of, well, let's pause, take a breath, and then go attack it again. And so I think, I think I mentioned that story to you one time, that on that particular day, in fact, I remember talking to Leon at the end of the day saying, what are we doing?
Yeah,
collecting vacuum cleaners.
Speaking of Home Depot, the first thing that Dave said to me when he first called me to be on this project, or asked me to be on the project, was, hey, what do you say we go to Home Depot and pull apart some, dishwashers and this and that, and, find motors to create a ventilator? And I was like, sure. Okay. So yeah, that was interesting. All right, so we iterated quickly, right? Mike and the team were all, iterating on the compressor and the pneumatic design, which was not a typical JPL process, right? But design went hand in hand with our next theme. I want to talk a little about testing, which is a very typical JPL process. Testing of a medical device, however, was a whole nother story. So if you can, Leon, describe to us some of the challenges involved in testing 2 different designs simultaneously, and maybe talking a little about scheduling.
Yeah, so, and also I didn't answer your previous question, which I'll quickly answer, and that's the review process. This is something that JPL does extremely well. We normally take a long time to prepare and our projects and so on. And we had a series of peer reviews. I remember that in 1 week, like every other day, we had another peer review, whether we started off with requirements, then medical, operations, regulatory, manufacturing, and those were rapid succession peer reviews where we would bring the design specification, requirements, and in that review process, we had mainly external people coming into our review. We reached out to Medtronic, we reached out to national laboratories like Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, Oak Ridge National Laboratories, hospitals, and so on. And they were part of the review process. So part of the testing, design, and iteration included the rapid review process that was put in place. And that was part of the secret sauce, if you want, of rapid prototyping, getting the feedback from experts, changing the design, and doing that on and on.
Right, that is wonderful. I remember earlier on in the process when we were deciding whether or not to build a test bed here at JPL or if we should go off lab. Can you tell us what were some of those equipment needs, Roger, and how did the team resolve that decision?
So at JPL, typically when we build spacecraft, we start off with the subsystem building a test bed, and then a system level test bed is all homegrown, and our verification and validation process is exhaustive. And so we're looking at a ventilator, and we had a choice of how can we test these things. Dr. Gurovich, once again, he knew a guy who could loan us a lung simulator, so we started testing. But as Leon had reached out to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and they were excited, I had a principle that was not going to be changed or modified, and that was we're going to have outside medical organizations test our ventilators. So we went on a 2-pronged path where we are testing internally, but we're going to send our unit out to Mount Sinai and ultimately to UCLA for testing. And that just worked out amazingly well. So our test bed approach was we'll test internally, we're going to expand our capabilities, our knowledge, but we don't build medical devices. And I want to make sure this ventilator gets tested by people who are in the business of saving lives.
Absolutely. So we really wanted to make sure that these external medical device companies or even doctors that we worked with were there to say, check, this actually works, and we would use it, right?
Absolutely.
So with a test bed on site and also external test beds, you said at Mount Sinai and UCLA, I want to talk about our next theme in our story, which is production and manufacturing of large quantities, which is not in the JPL toolbox, right? So first of all, wasn't RB Carpedian phenomenal in this role or what? I mean, he was at JPL making sure all the pieces are coming together. He's coordinating with the testing team, coordinating, talking to industry, figuring out the supply chain, managing people and expectations. So meanwhile, his kids are running around in the background. What were some of the important factors in the production of a successful ventilator for the production team? Let's go with you, Leon.
Yes, thank you. So clearly, RB was a real tour de force and real energy behind this topic. So he had a team of about a dozen people, and he worked with external consultants and people that he knew outside to put together the bill of materials, the detailed list of materials that would constitute the two types of ventilators, the pneumatic and the compressor. And that had to be reconciled with the prototypes that were being built in the laboratory. And RB had a few principles. One is that the supply chain could not interfere with existing legacy medical devices. That was a clear selling point. If we were to interfere with the existing supply chain, that would be basically a kiss of death. That would, we would be interfering with existing products. And we basically said that is not going to be our strategy. So that basically kept him from going after the same sensors, devices that Medtronic and Philips and others, GE, are using. And he was very successful in doing that. The other principle was to keep the parts count very low, to make this as simple as possible so that it could be manufactured in volume and that it would be low cost. And that interplay between production team and the prototyping design team was very, very critical, and it worked beautifully.
Absolutely. And speaking of interfering, looking at the supply chain, Roger, I want to ask you, I know that you faced a challenge earlier on. We were talking about this. Everyone on the team was so excited and so energetic, and they were calling everyone in industry and their grandmothers. Well, tell me, how did we manage that early on, especially when it came to the supply chain and finding components?
So, thank you, Sarah. Great question, and it's a great topic. So when we started, by the way, it's amazing that we know people who know people who know people. And so within the first week, I think I was having a conversation with a billionaire who runs a philanthropic organization. And I think RB knows about 200 people in the medical industry, and other companies. And so we did this very organic reach out to people, and we made some excellent connections, some connections that were crucial to our success. But it got to a point where there was more work in talking with the interfaces than we could, external companies and people than we could possibly do. And then in addition, I realized, Leon and I were talking at the end of the day, and we're realizing we have people at JPL who call somebody, and when they say we're from JPL and we're working on a ventilator, it implies a certain amount of gravitas. And so we put in a place that I said to the team, no more external interfaces that you generate, please. Work through Leon. We need to have some organization because, in fact, working with the outside people was running the risk of swamping Mike Johnson and his team. I think at one point or twice, he cried uncle that said, I'm trying to design this work and I can't keep answering questions external.
Right. And I know also, to add to that, I remember how another important factor was just not kind of publicizing that list, right, of components that we were working with, because if that list got out, if people knew what we were, what motor we were using, then what happens? I mean, people can start buying those motors, and now we don't even have the parts that we need, right? So that was really, really critical, and I'm glad we faced that challenge early on.
Sarah, I can just add to that. We did reach a critical decision point at some point where we were under actual pressure from a few sources to just open source the design. And in fact, Medtronic did that. They had 95,000 downloads of their design. But when we looked and studied this problem really carefully with outside consultants, what's the real likelihood of this being ultimately delivered to a hospital and to treat a patient, then open source is not necessarily the right way to do it. It might be for other cases. So many times what we heard when something goes open source, there are companies or there are scammers, there are people out there who will rush to buy the parts and therefore get in the way of the supply chain. And so that's maybe later on we'll talk about licensing. We actually came to that point where we traded off licensing versus open source, and we made a decision to go into licensing, which is a more controlled way of giving out the information.
Right. So as we look closely at the testing and the production team working together, I really want to move on to the next theme, which is about operations. And here we're going to watch a video which will highlight another very, very key aspect of the ventilator project, which represents the end user.
Designing something to be second nature to an expert in a field that we've never been in was no small task. What that meant was trying to figure out what we didn't know. We had to learn, and there was a ton to learn. We had to come up to speed really quickly. And so I was able to work with some phenomenal talent that we have at JPL, and we call them the studio. So members of the studio team that work specifically with design. The combination of engineers willing to be creative and a creative community also laser focused on solving this problem. To me, it's absolutely tremendous what we were able to come up with. And so getting to work with people from that team, getting to work with a few members of the medical community and having WebExes at all hours. We had late nights, weekends, you name it. People were on shift almost any time in the medical community, but we were too on the ventilator team. I honestly don't know that you could find any particular hour that there wasn't someone doing something. We can teach an expert, a trained respiratory therapist, to use this ventilator in 15 to 30 minutes. I still never actually even touched this ventilator. I'm looking forward to being able to do that one day. I mean, this is all while this team is working 90% remotely. We've created something that's actually going to help with this pandemic. The support that we all had for each other, the support our families gave us, to let us do this work at this important time, I'm forever going to be thankful.
Stacy, I share the same sentiment, and literally as of this morning, I was able to touch the ventilator for the first time. That was really exciting. I actually gave it a hug. It's so beautiful, and I never thought I would say a ventilator would be beautiful. Well, speaking of operations and human factors, is operations, specifically in the medical field, a core JPL skill, Leon?
Well, absolutely not. And even though, as you saw heard from Stacy, we have a phenomenal group of people, Dan Goods and his team in the studio, that really do specialize in human machine factors. So we have, again, a talented group of people, not specifically in the medical device domain. So what Stacy and her team did was reach out to hospitals, reach out to medical, not just hospitals, meaning doctors, but nurses and people who would operate these devices. And so though they were inputs, they were providing direct feedback into what needs to be displayed, what are the colors, what are the alarms, how would it be used. So we actually received a lot of those inputs through this team at JPL that Stacy led. And those were used in the design specification and look and feel of the ventilator that we have today.
Yes, I think none of us underestimated the importance of operations. Before I ask you, Roger, how we found Stacy, I'd like to read an email that just shows you a notion of, gives you a glimpse of how we recruited people. Here's a snippet of an email from Rob Manning to Stacy. Stacy, we need an operations person, and it would require a rather intense effort with meetings from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., including some hours during the weekends. Hundreds of emails, lots of material to review, back-to-back meetings, lots of reading, a strong sense of organization, a willingness to empower others to run, a key eye for obstacles and to fight, to eliminate obstacles. It requires interaction with lots of people inside of JPL and outside, and a willingness to be comfortable with quasi-stable organization, fluid with lots of dead ends and low probability of success. And he actually continues with another paragraph. If I were Stacy, I would have ran, right? Like, Roger, how did we get Stacy?
So in the early parts of the project, when we had these wonderful people doing their, Mike Johnson, the design team, Arby, everybody was just doing an amazing job early on. I looked around and I thought, there's a couple of roles that we need, FDA approval, and we need somebody to represent the doctors and the clinicians, the people who use this machine. So I talked with Rob, and there was a candidate we discussed, and it didn't work out. And then Rob said, how about Stacy? And I said, I know of her. I've watched her a little bit. Yeah, that sounds good. And so Stacy came on board. I gave her a call and said, Stacy, I don't know you that well, but how about you lead operations, and you be the interface who represents the doctors and the patient to the rest of the team and keep us on track.
Good job, Stacy. Lots of courage. Well, I want to take a quick second and show you the ventilator here. We have it with us today. We have both the pneumatic and the compressor. You might see it on the other screen here. This is the pneumatic and this is the compressor. And very interesting thing that I found about this ventilator, now seeing it in person for the first time, is it has this beautiful slight touch. It has a sticker of a poppy on there and a California reference. And I think this is so indicative of the studio and the graphics team and the human factors all working together hand in hand with Dr. Michael Gurvich and the end users to create an element of human touch where, if you're in the operating room, you look up, you're on this ventilator and you see that sticker, hopefully it brings a smile to your face. So I thought that was so interesting. This brings me to our next topic, regulatory. Roger, talk about how we got Chris Yonker to lead the regulatory team, and why was this a critical decision?
So the team framework, by the way, the team framework remains just amazing. And it was a combination of people like Dave Van Buren and Rob Manning reaching out to people and word of mouth, word on the street. And so we had two people from our robotics section, Brett and Chris. And Chris kept answering questions about what might be needed to get FDA approval because he had worked for a company that had done some work in that area. And so it was a situation of, you look to be the most qualified, you're it. You're in charge of FDA approval, kind of like Stacy, you're in charge of medical devices. Go read up about 200,000 pages of documentation and then tell us what we need to do. Okay, that's an exaggeration. Maybe it was 50,000 pages of documentation.
I'm sure it was 200,000 pages. Well, yeah, I can't imagine how much they had to read. And he had a whole team supporting them. And literally, they were constantly digging through documents and documents of requirements and EUA submission. What do we need to do? And I distinctly remember right before we started testing, there was a new document out with newer EUA requirements. So the whole team scrambling to find the actual requirements, and Brett is trying to update the requirements document. And then we're doing, updating the testing procedures. So it was a lot of juggling and interfacing with the other teams. Now, I want to ask you, Leon, about some of the connections to HHS, the FDA, DHS, NASA headquarters, and how they helped this team move the prototype rapidly forward. Can you tell us about that, please?
Absolutely. And I will start with the FDA because once I contacted Dr. James Lee, and he basically said he'll help us, he assigned a point of contact to us, Dr. Brandon Blakely. So we had a designated person on his team that was supporting us and answering questions, reviewing our documents, coming to our reviews. But also I want to give credit to J.D. Polk, who's the Chief Medical Officer at NASA, Kathy Mangum as well. But J.D. was our main champion. So a few times J.D. Polk and I would talk to Dr. James Lee, but he was also critical in interfacing, opening up channels to the Department of Homeland Security, Wendy Hall and many others, HHS, FEMA, and so on. So having those relationships was really critical to for the project to move forward.
Absolutely, I know that.
Sarah, if there's something I do want to add, because when we started this process, FDA approval typically takes years, and I thought we may get a design. The FDA approval might be too tough. Chris made friendships with people on the FDA team, and I have to give a shout out to the FDA. I mean, they worked weekends. They were highly motivated. I never knew I'd see a government bureaucracy work so quickly and to overcome challenges and problems. So, you know, for amongst us, I'll just give a shout out to the FDA and Chris's interaction with them. I was very pleasantly surprised.
In fact, Roger and Sarah, they James Lee mentioned that we asked them how long would it take to get FDA approval under the emergency use authorization. And the answer was if they get a complete set of documents, that they can turn it around within a day or day and a half. And they did that.
That was incredible. I just remember how Chris would submit his documentation, and then within an hour or so, Brandon and the FDA team would respond back with, you know, make this update. And then if we didn't make the update quickly, then he would actually get another email saying, where's the documentation? So they were definitely after us, and they really wanted us to succeed. And I really did feel that. So I just really quickly want to touch on, maybe Roger, you can tell us how long did it take to get FDA approval? And then maybe tell us a little about the vacation that one of the ventilators took and all the way to where?
Well, let's see. So first of all, so we had a whiteboard with scribbles that would become functional requirements, and Mike John's gone up there and said, well, you know, if we do this and we look at a pressure source, and we went from that to basically one of those ventilators in 5 weeks. In 5 weeks plus 2 days, we had FDA approval. In 5 days.
That's absolutely incredible, by the way. I mean, who has done that before?
It really is amazing. In 5 weeks and 4 days, in 5 weeks and 3 days, it was highlighted in a NASA-wide press release. And in 5 weeks and 5 days, Dave Gallagher was talking to the President of the United States saying, what we have here is a minimum capability ventilator capable of meeting the needs of a significant fraction of the COVID population. So it was interesting, because I thought, I think those are my words, and he's talking to the President of the United States. But the time frame of start to 5 weeks plus 5 weeks, 2 days FDA approval to the President of the United States, it was incredible.
That's phenomenal. I just remember Arby like actually looking on the FedEx page or however we sent it and just tracking it. He was like, I can't go on vacation, but here's the ventilator traveling all over the US, and now it's at the White House, right? We were like following the ventilator back to back. That was incredible. So now I want to go to our final topic about licensing, which is very exciting because the ventilator project has not ended. This is a continuing project, and we're very deep into the licensing theme. Leon, please describe some of your earlier conversations with Roger about, first of all, how to proceed with keeping the design open source, or if we should license it.
Yeah, well, the licensing direction came really later in the discussion. We originally thought that this will be, that we will be selecting a manufacturing partner and then contracting with that manufacturer, and that the money would come from the federal government. And that's how J.D. Polk and NASA was operating, that they were trying to get us to get FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. stockpile, to basically issue a purchase order for certain tens of thousands of ventilators. Once we had that in hand, we can go out with a contract and we're in business. Well, that didn't happen so smoothly. And we sensed that this was not necessarily going to happen that easily. So Roger and I had a after hours kind of a conversation, and we just jointly decided that we have to pivot. We need to do something differently. And so licensing became an option to simply look at this as a technology, and let's just go open and make a call for proposals to manufacture. Very different than open source. Open source is you put it on the website and anybody can download it anywhere in the world. This was more of a controlled and a selective approach. So we did that, and it helped that the fact that the president and NASA were giving us a huge campaign. This was covered by CNN, by local channels. This video that we saw earlier today was part of that campaign. So this word went out worldwide. And so we actually went through a very well coordinated process. We solicited companies to register across the world on our website. And then we had a Q&A session with them. Then about 100 proposals were received, 10 pages each. We reviewed all of them, down selected, then had one-on-one Q&A with each one of these potential licensees. And as of today, we have 28 qualified licensees, of which 8 of them in the US, 20 of them across the world, including Brazil, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, and Canada, and many others. And actually, as of today, about half of them have already built a functioning prototype, much like we've done at JPL.
So I'm wondering, Leon and Roger, as you were sitting in on these conversations, and I actually got to sit in on a couple of them, I know you talked to countries all over. How did you feel? Were you anxious? Were you nervous about it? Did you have any anxiety about, you know, are we going to find a company to do this? How did you feel?
So I'll answer this. There were several times where we pivoted, and there were also several in the development of this ventilator. There were also several times where we were racing at full speed, not knowing that there was a solution. The production of the ventilator was one of those. I recall talking to the team a few times saying, we're going to run to the cliff and there better be a bridge when we get there. But at the moment, just keep going full speed ahead. Production was, first the FDA approval was one of those, can it happen? And the other was, what do we do for production? And so when Leon and I were talking about licensing, I was extremely thrilled because it was an opportunity to get the design, which would have FDA approval, out to the places that needed it. As time passed, we realized the COVID crisis in the United States was not going to exceed the number of ventilators. And so it was not going to be needed in the United States. But in other parts of the world, and some of them somewhat impoverished parts of the world, there was anticipated still to be a great need. And so the work that we did, that NASA, JPL, and Caltech supported, was going to find fruition over there. So for me, I was just very, very thrilled. I was thrilled with the capability of the people who were the companies that responded to our license call. And in talking to the individuals, I was convinced, for those that I sat in on, that company is capable of building this. In fact, that was one of our criteria. We did not pick a company unless they showed the financial and technical capability to see this through fruition. Leon, what did you think of it?
Well, I thank you, Roger and Sarah. I was really excited, and I felt the excitement in the team, our team that was interviewing them. Dave Van Buren was in all of them, and he was radiating always excitement and so on. And just to be clear, so that everybody here understands, we included a company from Nigeria, so Egypt, Armenia, Turkey. So these are places that, just getting the license from Caltech to build this, they were just, really, really excited. But we still had criterias. Can you manufacture? Can you build? Can you develop the software? So we had pretty, I would say, reasonable criteria. We were not trying to be overly strict, but we were generally really excited. It really felt good to be helping the world.
Absolutely. And I know helping a little bit with managing that process with Raphael as well, about which ventilators were going where, because all these companies wanted a ventilator to look at and emulate in their process was such an important feat. And also working with the testing and production team with Michelle Easter and having these prototypes ready. So there was just this interconnected web of all these things that needed to be ready, right? Before we could send everything off to all these countries and hoping that they were going to be successful. Well, I would love more than ever to now hear your questions for the panelists in this Q&A session. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and submit your question in the Q&A box below. And please do include your name and affiliation. And I will be looking through them and start asking Roger and Leon.
So Sarah, I will add something here as we have finished our more formal talk, and that was, I want to give a shout out to a variety of places and people. During this COVID situation, as we were working on this, the outpouring of support was quite remarkable. We had commercial companies call us. Brian Lim identified one, and we talked to them and they said, we want to help you, don't pay us. And they did some important engineering work. The FDA, I already mentioned. Caltech was amazing. JPL acquisition, it typically takes months to get a contract in place. We established a contract, I think, in 6 hours. And so whether it was JPL or Caltech OGC or licensing support or some of these companies, it was really heartwarming to find people that said, how can I help you? And I'll work on this overnight and give you an answer tomorrow. So, you know, this was JPL. Clearly, we had a marvelous team. The highlight.
That's a great suggestion, Roger. And I want to add to that shout out Medtronic. And Sarah, if you don't mind, I'll say a few words because it's answering one of the questions in the chat room, in the Q&A. And that was why did we do this design? Why did we come up with a unique design rather than just scaling an existing design? And that's an important question that is already in the Q&A. And so I want to say that at the beginning, we, again, knowing that this is not our field, I reached out to Caltech. In fact, it was reached out to Indrani Grotzik at JPL. They reached out to the corporate partnerships and technology transfer office at Caltech. And they put us in touch with the head of Medtronic. They reached out to the executive chairman, Omar Ishraq, and they assigned to us a high-level individual, Marcus Reiter, who gave me a call. This is right at the beginning, at the first week of the project. From there on, every review, Medtronic people were on our review board. They did not ask for anything. They did not end up licensing it. They were helping us. And when I first talked to Marcus, he basically said that he was contacted by their CEO, their chairman, executive chairman, and that he asked them to design a brand new ventilator from scratch without any legacy of their existing Medtronic ventilators. And he ended up telling his CEO that JPL is already doing something like this, and they're in better shape to do it because they're not a ventilator company. So when I talked to Marcus, I was like, are you sure? I mean, that you would really want to say that? He says, absolutely. He's going to help us.
Even though we're not a medical company?
Because we were not inhibited by legacy design. And he was being asked by his CEO, no, don't scale, start from scratch and come up with something that can be done quickly. And so we brought in Medtronic and we were kind of doing on our own what was asked by Medtronic from their CEO. And he ended up joining our team, and Medtronic was with us for weeks and weeks in all our reviews, and they were a tremendous help.
It was absolutely tremendous, and I'm glad that you both brought that out. Now, I'd love to move on to the question and answer session. We have great questions, so I'd like to start off with a question from Ron Constable, and his question is for Roger. How did you get the requirements, the pressure levels, pressure profiles, tolerance on pressure, available controls, sterilization needs, and then how were they met? So first, how did you come up with those requirements, and then how were they met?
How were they met? They were all met. So that part is easy. We made such improvement and advancements in that very first meeting with Dr. Gurevich. And so Dr. Mike talked about what we needed to do. He told us you need higher pressure for COVID patients than otherwise. He described you need an oxygen concentration of certain fashion. He described some of the risks with ventilators of how they can pose a health risk as opposed to a help. And so, Sarah, I think you're the one that were writing that down on the whiteboard, and we captured those and we categorized them and all of that. And then, as Leon mentioned, we had a design review of a traditional sort, and then we had a workshop with a variety of doctors, and mostly our engineers watched the doctors debate back and forth. You have to measure the acidification of the CO2 coming out. Yes, no. Well, that can be an external device. And so the requirements that we started with from Dr. G were probably 90% fine. And then they were refined with the doctors going back and forth. And it was fun to watch the doctors argue and then reach an agreement on what our functional requirements needed to be. And that's how we came to those, and we have met them all.
Yes.
You know, and Sarah, it's important to understand that this ventilator does not match up to the full functional ventilators that Medtronic has, which takes the expiratory gases from a patient back into the ventilator and has a closed loop with the gases. As Roger said, we were working these requirements so that they're sufficient, but not a full-blown ventilator. So there were areas where we had to cut off and say, we're not going to do this because for these COVID class of patients, it's good enough to do this. And so we kind of narrowed down the requirements to those needed to be a functioning, high performance, but not a complete ventilator for all possible situations. It is focused on COVID, treating COVID patients, and it is a patient assist device, so it does detect the breathing. It's a fully intubated into an adult patient, so it is quite sophisticated.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We have another question from Joe Witt, Caltech Associates board member. The question is for Roger. Have you heard any stories from patients or doctors? And Roger, you can answer that first, and then Leon.
So Leon can answer that better, but I'll just tell you right now, we have a company in Brazil that has achieved certification. We have the first units coming out right now. And so to my knowledge, none of our ventilators have actually been used on a patient. They are in the stages of either starting, initiating, or in some places, starting to have production go out the door. So we're waiting for that story when one of our ventilators is used on a patient and saves a life. Leon?
Well, that is correct. However, we, as you mentioned before, we have both Mount Sinai and UCLA give us feedback from a usability point of view, from a clinical treatment point of view, everything short of a patient feedback. We have had requests to do human trials in the US, but we have not pursued that. That's up to the licensees.
Excellent, thank you. Question from Benji Donitz, JPL Formulation Systems Engineer. His question is, are there any lessons learned from rapid prototyping, implementation, and review from VITAL that could feed forward into rapid response for a spacecraft, for use cases like planetary defense or to respond to targets of opportunity?
So we are in the middle of, and Bob Manning has played a key role in this, as has Leon, the whole team. So we are capturing our lessons learned. We've had an expert come in, and we have had these WebEx experiences where people describe, this is what worked well, these are my experiences, and we're in the process of capturing those. I personally think that for things like new technology developments, there is a lot that we did that is applicable. For, you know, multi-billion-dollar flagship spacecraft missions, we probably have to follow the processes that we currently follow, is where I think we'll end up. But we are collecting and then soon to be publishing lessons learned.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've discussed this and we've kind of thought about it a lot, because it would be nice if we can say, you know, why can't we do our Mars 2020 or Mars sample return with lessons learned from this project? Well, it's not that simple. It really is not. And a lot of what was done on VITAL was there was a huge exuberance factor. You know, we didn't cover it here, but in the first 30, 40 days, we as a team did not have a single day off. Not a Sunday, not a Saturday off. And,
I attest to that.
And so that's not a sustainable kind of mode of operation. And so it's hard to really extrapolate everything, at least from VITAL, into how we do regular projects. But as Roger said, in terms of rapid prototyping in technology area, in other areas, certainly there's lots of things that can be carried forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Leon, this question is from Eric Kreidler, Caltech Associates Community Committee member. Are you still accepting licensing applications? And if so, what are the requirements?
Yes, the short answer is yes, we are. In other words, we decided early on that we will not turn away anybody requesting licenses. You would have to go to our medical engineering website. I don't know if I can type it in the chat room, and simply download the memo. And there are simple 4 questions that you need to answer in terms of manufacturability and maintenance and so on. And you can apply for a license today, and we will give it a fair consideration. Have in mind that there are already 28 licensees, of which half of them are already ready to start manufacturing. But if there's a credible request, we will consider it. It's at the JPL website. I can type it in.
That's exciting. Go apply. Okay, so there's another question, and this one's for you, Roger, from Rogelio Rodriguez. I know that FDA and official approval was vital, which led JPL to get certification. What did this team think of the early efforts from MIT and their emergency ventilator project and Tesla/Elon Musk's efforts with ventilators? Ooh, that's a tough one.
So it's the early history of our project, Leon and I had numerous calls. Rob Manning, I think it was the first week, Rob Manning said, I'm calling this ventilator company. And so we had a conversation with a really nice gentleman up in the Pacific Northwest, 9 o'clock at night. We talked with Lawrence Livermore. We were aware of what MIT was doing. We talked with SpaceX and other companies as well. And we found our path, which was minimum functional capability, ventilator capable of meeting a significant fraction with FDA approval. And we watched some other efforts that were, let's build something out of Home Depot parts and we'll put it out there. We watched other companies actually have press releases that announced what they were doing. And, I'm talking with Dave Gallagher and we all agreed, we were going to over deliver and under promise. So we never put out a press release until we had FDA approval or it was imminent. And so I don't want to talk about, different companies had their own way of doing efforts, and what the SpaceX and several other companies were doing was a team with a mass manufacturer, between a mass manufacturer and a ventilator company to start producing these items. And what they are producing, as Leon alluded to, they are producing, $30,000, $40,000 ventilators with several computers that do an analysis on the gas that's returned back from the lungs. And so we have a different market focus for what the ventilator is intended to do. And the ventilator is intended for an emergency use authorization. So there are some limitations, and it's targeted at COVID situations.
Absolutely. I love that we didn't lose focus, but really allowed other companies to help us along the way and took their advice. So another question from Sue Alvarez, Caltech Associates member. You've mentioned several teams and departments. Leon, how many people were actually involved in this project?
So the number of people in total that were involved in the project, certainly not full-time, was of the order about 100 people that were involved in various capacities at various levels on the project. And it certainly was not a constant. So it was a pretty large group of people that were involved. And when you compare this, let's say, to universities or small companies, we clearly had both the technologies and the capabilities and the resources and the laboratories to do a pretty complicated and serious device like we did.
Yes, and I want to actually add to Sue's question. Maybe you can tell the listeners what fraction were actually on lab versus working off lab?
Well, most of them were off lab. So I think you mentioned, I think clearly about 90% of the people were all working from their homes, and only a small fraction, I would say 10% at most, were working in the lab. But I also want to add to the previous question that we were keeping very close track of what's going on at universities, at University of Minnesota, at Oxford, at University of Florida, MIT, all the other, Stanford had 2 different designs. So we were actually in touch with them, and we were looking at what was going on in other places. A few of them were going for clearly non-FDA approved devices, which was not something we were going to do. And then a few of them had heritage to ambubags, which you use a motor to press and create the pressure through ambubags. We decided not to do that, and so on. So our design was pretty different than the university designs.
So Sarah, I'm going to add one thing. We had that first meeting, and then I've only been on lab 1 day since then, and I went to the ventilator lab and I saw, I think, 6 people. So the number of people who were on lab at any one point, I think, was never maybe more than 12 people, and typically was, I think, around 6 folks. But I'll point out that, we were building some electronics boards, and one of our team members, Brandon, did the design work and then assembled surface mount technology at home. It's amazing he has that capability. So some of the earlier prototypes were built in somebody's workshop at home in an effort to get things done in these challenging times.
Yeah, I think Brandon Metz's youngest daughter was actually soldering some PCBs in their house, right?
That could well be.
No, we're... Okay, well, we have time for one more question. This one comes from Jay Kim, a Caltech parent. Thank you, Jay. The question is, when are you thinking of starting mass production, and how many devices do you expect to be manufactured? And
I'm sorry, I'll let Leon handle that question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So the closest we have to actual manufacturing is actually in Brazil. There are 2 companies that teamed up. We had 3 licensees from Brazil. One actually dropped out, and the 2 just issued a press release a few days ago. They received their Anvisia, which is their FDA approval, and they were...
I told you.
The gardeners are there.
The dogs are barking.
Yeah, they were initially going to get 3,000 orders. They're still working on it. But to my understanding, nobody has of yet built a large scale, but it's very early in the process.
Oh, wow. Yes, thank you for that. All right, so we've run out of time, unfortunately. I would love to answer more questions, but what do you all say? Has this not been a much needed break? And has it not infused in us the motivation to just keep persisting, to keep focusing on helping others in this crisis? Thank you so much, Leon and Roger, for taking the time to give each of us, a glimpse into the story behind the Vital Ventilator and team, all those involved on the team, the production team, and also a special thanks to Dave Van Buren and Rob Manning, who have been helping filter the questions during the Q&A session. Now, Chip, back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. What a comprehensive presentation. And thank you, Roger, Leon, Rob, and all the JPL employees and associate staff who helped put this together today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
The Associates has many more virtual events planned for the remainder of this year, and we hope you can join us. Our next event is on September 22nd with Caltech Professor Jess Adkins, who will share his unique approach to pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Links to our events will be posted in the chat feature. For those of you who joined us as guests today, keep an eye out for an email with more information about the Associates. There are also links to membership information in the chat feature. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good night.